It is impossible to speak about the concept of action learning without mentioning the visionary role of Professor Reg Revans. Since 1928, Professor Revans has applied action learning in many diverse situations, from the jungles of Nigeria and the classrooms of Leningrad to the directorates of Belgium. In essence, his equation for learning is L equals P plus Q, that is, programmed knowledge plus questioning insight. Programmed knowledge, or knowledge learned from books and experts, is inadequate to keep pace with a rapidly changing world. Therefore, Professor Revans suggests that learning should be supplemented by questioning insight. And it is this question-based approach to learning that differs from normal training. Learning how to ask questions in conditions of risk and uncertainty is what action learning is all about. By working together on real problems like comrades in adversity, we can learn with and from each other. John Marney and Dennis Lowney spoke to Professor Revans at the First World Congress on Action Research and Process Management in Brisbane and asked what triggered his interest in this area.
I think the first impression I ever had that we must recognize the limitations of our own abilities. We may have university degrees, we may have been professors, we may be extremely highly regarded as competent experts, but we must also remember that when we deal with reality, which is a very complicated thing compared with what you study in a university, you need something other than your knowledge. You need to be wise as well as being clever. And this was first brought home to me by my father. My father was eventually His Majesty's Principal Surveyor of Mercantile Shipping. And when I was very small, Britain was then by far the biggest, had the biggest merchant fleet in the world. So looking after its safety measures, the design of its ships and so forth, was a very important job. My father, when I was 5 years of age in 1912, was a major contributor to the inquiry into the loss of Titanic, which had sunk in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with a loss of 1,500 lives. And I can remember as a little boy of 5 the excitement of all this. But later on I asked my father what he thought he had learned most from this inquiry. And he said, it is the difference between cleverness and wisdom. You can have all kinds of clever people who will design vessels for you, all kinds of able mariners to run them out to sea for you. But if you run into unusual conditions, you may have not only to have a lot of experts who understand this, that, and the other. You may need wise people who take a wider view and say, look here, I think I understand this, but there are certain very profound questions I should be asking myself. If I run away with the idea that I understand everything there is because I am expertly qualified, I'm not only get into trouble, but people around me too. Now this I picked up when I was quite young, but it came out later on when I, at the age of 23, when I entered the Cavendish, no, 21. I entered the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, which was without any doubt the biggest concentration of intellectual ability on human record. We had 10 Nobel Prize winners at the time, 10 Nobel Prize winners in one laboratory. There are many states which are glad to have one Nobel Prize winner among its total inhabitants. Many universities which are very proud to have one in the whole university. We had 10 in one department, physics. And there I learned what my father, I saw what my father had said about the difference between being clever and being wise. Because once a week once a week, all these geniuses, and for 7 years I shared their company, all these geniuses met, they had a seminar, and you were allowed and encouraged to speak at that seminar on condition that you spoke about things which weren't going well with your work. I haven't met any organization anywhere else where the people got together in order to barter their ignorance, their confusion, their misunderstandings. Normally when clever people get together, my golly, you should see how they behave. Their sole, their only activity is to convince each other that they know more about what's going on than anybody else. But the Titanic inquiry didn't run to that effect, nor did the Cavendish. And I've heard Rutherford, a marvellous chap, son of a New Zealand sheep farmer, say more than once, what impresses me most about this discussion is my own bloody ignorance. What does yours look like to you? So that was long, long ago, and one time a chap called Einstein turned up at this, and I had one or two conversations, even cleaned the blackboard for him. So action learning came out of quite serious discussions about how we were trying to do such things as discover the neutron or find out what the atom was. So there, I learned that topics can be very interesting, but you must never run away with the idea that you understand them. And action learning has, in the subsequent 50 years, said, look, if we really are going to understand the mess this, whatever it may be, is in, it's not enough to rely upon our expert knowledge. Expert knowledge is necessary, but it is not sufficient. We have to learn how to ask ourselves totally different questions. That's what action learning is.
What are the benefits of action learning as you see it, as distinct from traditional learning?
Well, let me quote not Albert Einstein or Lord Rutherford, but the school children of Perth. There must be people even in Brisbane who've heard of Perth. I had turned this whole idea that the distinction between cleverness and wisdom, I tried to simplify it by saying we learn in this life, that is, we become acquainted to deal with conditions which might arise tomorrow, which didn't arise yesterday. We get used to dealing with change, and I'm very glad to see that a lot of Australians are asking this question. Things are changing, how do we deal with them? Well, the children of Perth heard that I had been talking about this learning equation that I call it. I say learning consists in two things: what other people tell you and what you may think up for yourself. That's a very simple way of putting it. But day after day you can be attending lectures, you can even be watching me on television for that, or video for that matter. You can be picking up ideas you get from other people, and they may be helpful. But if you say, this man or this woman understands so much about this topic that I needn't start asking myself fresh questions, you're in trouble. And the school children of Perth somehow found that I had been talking about action learning. Learning equals P, programmed instruction, plus Q, questioning insight. L equals P plus Q. These kids had been picking this up, and they met the children from other schools and said, look, we should be thinking about our school syllabus and having much more chance to ask questions than we're getting at the moment. And they wrote a paper called the Q Factor Centre, which they sent to the Ministry of Education, saying what we should be doing in school is giving a lot more time to questioning. And this has led to many things. The Ministry of Education sent the paper that these children had written to me in Manchester. I said, marvellous to think that here are these youngsters, aged between, I think, 13 and 17, saying, how do we develop our questioning insight? By building a Q Factor Centre. And I showed the paper that that they had written to a lot of people from Leningrad, the United States, at a big international conference, and said, you write from Leningrad to Perth, or from Cincinnati to Perth, or from Stockholm to Perth, because it's only if your children exchange their ideas with the other children that true learning will take place. So what I'm hoping is that action learning adds to traditional learning, to traditional education, this positive interest in how do I ask myself fresh questions. It's quite true. Before I can answer the question, before I can find the answer to the question, either by going to somebody who I think might know the answer, or turning to the encyclopedia and looking up the answer there, before I can expect to get the question answered, I have to discover what is the relevant question to put. This may be a bit difficult to explain, but I think the difference between action learning and traditional education is that action learning puts the first emphasis upon what it is you don't know and how you explore this ignorance of yours in order to say, now these are the questions which I should put, now I want the help of other people to answer the questions, or I must go to the library to get the answer.
Professor, these are very contentious issues probably with some traditional educationalists. What problems have you run into in that regard?
Well, they're very contentious, and that's why I'm so delighted that not only the children in Perth, but a lot of other people in Australia are beginning to see that traditional education doesn't so much have to be challenged or attacked, but it has to be encouraged to modify itself. But that's happening in Australia. Now let me tell you some of the problems I've run into. When I became a professor at the University of Manchester, that was my first professorship, I got that professorship because, as the evidence will show, I had persuaded the colliery managers. In those days, the coal industry was Britain's biggest and most powerful industry, and I was asked by the owners of the coal industry to see what could be done to raise its efficiency. I said, if we're going to educate the colliery managers, we must get the colliery managers themselves to argue with each other about their problems. You can't send somebody into a party of colliery managers, somebody who's never managed a coal mine, some of them not even having been down a coal mine, and get them to lecture the managers. But by getting the managers together to discuss with each other their here and now problems, that so improved the efficiency of the pits, as the evidence will show you, that I was invited to become a professor at the University of Manchester. Now, it's one thing to say to real colliery managers, look, get together and argue about your problems with each other, and you'll see the solution of them by trying to build on the most precious asset which the industry has, which, of course, is the lived experience of its real managers. But when I tried to introduce this same idea into a university, things were very different, and I was opposed by all the experts, the professors of sociology, the professors of economics, even some of the professors of what was then called management. They didn't like the notion that it was the people who carried the final responsibility, whether it's the children in the classrooms in Perth, or the managers in the pits, or the surgeons in the operating theatres. My argument to the professors that no, we must get an entirely fresh way of thinking about our problems was bitterly opposed. I couldn't get any support. I actually had to resign my professorship at Manchester and move to a foreign country, and I worked for 10 years in Belgium. So there's plenty of opposition, and when I came out first with that was on manufacturing industry. The evidence for that is very clear indeed. But I did the same thing in hospitals, and when I came out and showed that patients recovered more quickly when the nurses were encouraged to discuss with each other what their problems were instead of listening to some, or in addition to listening to some expert on hospital organization. When I showed this was true, I was actually ridiculed by the professional papers as getting into moral evangelism. Moral evangelism, just think of this, that I was accused of that because I was saying these nurses have got values and motivation and experience which if we're professional lecturers and teachers, we simply don't understand because we haven't gone through it as the nurses looking after a dying child have experienced. And because I was touching on this, I was accused of moral evangelism. So, but things, that's 20, 25 years ago, things are changing all right, and particularly in Australia.
Professor, it seems to me you're saying that action learning it can be a process where people take charge of some of their own learning and development in many respects. Do some people not like to do that?
Well, when you say take charge, they take charge of everything in their immediate here and now. For example, if you like to read the literature, you'll find the Japanese got from me, they call it the Q circle, the quality circle. That was copied from my early work, and there's plenty of independent evidence to show that. But in the quality circle, the workers in a particular part of the factory get together among themselves and share their experience. What they are learning to control, to take charge of, in answer to your question, is their own here and now activities. They're not saying, oh, we are also taking charge of the company as a whole, and we're not going to say this company is now so prosperous that it must actually buy the Rockefeller Center on Manhattan Island, which Japan has done. But that wasn't done by the workers who were doing action learning. But at different levels, yes, I think the action learners who got together in the big enterprises of Belgium, including her 4 largest banks and her biggest manufacturing companies, they got together and said, we're going to see what we can do to help each other solve the terrible problems that are pressing on us. They were almost, I suppose one could say, taking over the whole economy in a sense, because Belgium is so dependent upon the efficiency of its manufacturing industry that if this isn't efficient, the whole country isn't efficient. So in a sense, the action learning of the presidents of Belgium's score and more of biggest enterprises was, in a sense, dictating the whole development of the Belgian economy. But in answering a question like yours, we must be careful not to be too general, to look at the particular conditions, whether it's the 10, 12 workers on the floor breaking off their work for a couple of hours to run a quality circle, or whether it's the constant meeting of the presidents of big enterprises. So,
Professor Esmonds, you've been involved in action learning for many, many years, and you must have seen and noted the developments that have occurred in that time. Are you encouraged by the direction that it's heading at the moment?
Oh yes, very encouraged, yes. What pleases me most is at no time have I ever tried to set myself up as an action learning expert. It's true, I've been a professor but there's no chair of action learning in any university that I'm aware of, and I've never been running a consultancy or anything like that. I've never advertised action learning and said I can be engaged. I understand there are people in the United States who are selling action learning of a very dubious character and getting $10,000 a day for doing so, but I've never had anything like that. Quite apart from that, yes, I think there's a recognition all over the world that we've got to get those who actually carry the responsibility for dealing with the here and now problems to have authority for tackling them and dealing with them, quite apart from that of the bosses over them. I don't want to get into politics, but in the last 6 months, the news about action learning is getting around the world, and since the pulling down of the Berlin Wall, I've had invitations from Bucharest, Warsaw, Leningrad to go and talk about action learning over there, because my learning equation that I mentioned, L equals P plus Q, is also, you can say, well, P is bureaucracy and Q is perestroika. Was what Gorbachev is saying. Okay, we've organized the country, the Soviet Union, from Moscow downwards for a long time. Now let's get the people involved at the bottom. This is exactly what the school children of Perth are saying about their education.
In recent times, excuse me, whenever we hear action learning, we often hear it in conjunction with action research.
Yeah.
What do you understand by action research?
Well, as far as I understand action research, and 40 years ago I used to hear it, and I wrote my first paper on action learning 52 years ago, but 40 years ago when I was hearing about action research, largely from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a chap called Kurt Lewin was talking about action research. He was saying, if we are, as MIT, which I acknowledge to be the leading institution in the world for trying to understand the problems of manufacturing and so forth, he said, if we are going to understand what goes on in so complex a system as a vast factory making motor cars, it's all very well for the clever professor to be able to go to a board and draw on it all kinds of lines and dotted lines, the structure, and saying this is the movement of the material through here. We can have all that. We can develop operational research in highly logical fashions using complex mathematical analysis, but we've also got to understand the human problems, and therefore we must involve not only the clever people who know how to program computers and work out queuing theorems and so forth, we've also got to involve the work people themselves. So they started talking about action research, research which involved the activities of the human beings who weren't in any way qualified to be professors or lecturers or research workers, but could we get some people, some research workers, a professor or a man writing his doctoral dissertation, get him in there to design the project on which the research is going to be made, but then involve all kinds of people who neither have his qualifications nor are seeking them, to get involved in the reality of what he's doing. Okay, that I understand to be action research. It is like action learning to some extent, in that it involves all kinds of people whose main motivation is, okay, what are we up to? Why are we doing this? How's it going to affect what we're doing? It's that, rather than being interested in writing some 500-page dissertation, which is then going to be examined by a lot of professors to say, oh, there's a mistake on page 264 or something. So I think action learning goes for as far as possible, for the total reality, whereas action research is half academic research and half reality.
Mm. Professor, are there ways, do you think, where, and perhaps you've answered already, but are there ways in which action learning and traditional methods can move together and advance? You gave the Perth example.
Yes.
Are there others where you see a harmonious relationship there?
Well, don't forget that it's very difficult in this life to get a new idea anywhere. There was a famous German philosopher, poor chap, died mentally disturbed, a fellow called Nietzsche. Alas, he had a very powerful influence on that German fellow. What was his name? Schicklgruber, Hitler. But he said, while he was still young and sane, he said, if you think you have a new idea, see what happens. Unless it is opposed by the stupid and ridiculed by the clever, it can have nothing new in it. So therefore drop it. So if you come forward with any new idea anywhere, the greatest compliment you can be paid is to find yourself being ridiculed by a professor, say, of sociology or economics. That shows that you're onto something new. But after 2 or 3 decades, things begin to change. And I notice that, particularly in Australia, the universities here are very interested in action learning. I've been talking about it at several, at Deakin, at Murdoch, at Hawkesbury, and now here, of course, in the 2 universities in Brisbane. They're very positive indeed. But exactly how you introduce a new idea into a system is not for me to say. The people running the system will do that. But I'm quite sure that given a little while, it'll be accepted all right. Whether they'll have a professor of action learning, I don't know. I would strongly advise against it, because if they do, then somebody will begin to say, but action learning has a definite structure. You can either be an expert in it or you can't. But once you reach that point, drop action learning altogether. It must rely upon you, as Rutherford said. What impresses me is my own bloody ignorance. What does yours look like to you? That's the essence of action learning. But I'm quite sure the spirit of it will percolate all through the universities. And I can see it happening already here in Australia. Even in Europe, there is now the European universities in Finland, the Netherlands, Spain, Germany, France. I haven't yet met one in England, but the European universities have now set up an organization called the European Association for the Strategic Management of Universities, and they've written to me to say, could I talk to them about action learning? But don't think that anything's going to happen by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, or even by this time next week. It may take a year or 2, but it's coming all right.
From what you've said, Professor Evans, one of the interesting things that occurs to me is that action learning is something like the links between different disciplines, and it's allowing people to think across disciplines. Would you see this as one of the valuable aspects of action learning in the future? How we might proceed to develop action learning theories and concepts along those lines?
Well, I think the fundamental concept is so simple that, well, I should be extremely interested to see illustrations of it being applied. But I think the idea is so simple that if you have some very complex set of conditions, and those conditions may be wider even than the group of people around them. Let me give an example. You must have heard of a chap called Isaac Newton. When Isaac Newton was an old man, but not as old as I am at the present moment, let me assure you, somebody said to him, well, Isaac, what have you found in life? After all, Isaac Newton was the first man to demonstrate that the universe is one gigantic mechanism. He brought in the laws of universal gravitation. He explained to us what is the nature of light. He invented the differential calculus and so forth. So he thought of a few things. But he said, I feel all my life like a little boy who has been wandering along a beach. And from time to time, he said, I picked up a beautiful stone and looked at it and thought how lovely it was, or a shell, and saw what a beautiful thing that was. And he said, I gave a little attention to these. I might even have written something about them. But in front of me was the whole ocean of my ignorance, which I didn't know. If this idea of Newton's could become much more the spirit of the universities, I think that would mean that we'd have people from different professions, different walks of life, masters of different disciplines who would all say, well, we've got a little stone here or a little shell there, but if what we're exploring is the whole beach, for heaven's sake, let's get together and explore together. And if I'm going to explore the beach with you, I should want to know something of what you're thinking and what I'm thinking, but don't let's run away with the idea that because there's 20 of us here, we understand the whole lot. Not at all. So I think this action learning I would like to see it as something mentioned and talked about in universities, but not professed by some particular lot of people. Otherwise, they'd imprison it in their own, and it would cease to be doing what it is doing.
How do we actually get people to think along those lines?
Oh, I think it's happening. I think that the world, the complexity of the world is now being noticed by a lot of people. They see that you cannot solve the complex problems of reality by engaging highly specialized people here and there, even though they call themselves specialized generalists or so forth. So when I see where action learning has worked in hospitals, in the care of the mentally handicapped, in international banking, even the Public Service Board of Victoria used it to reorganize the State Coordination Council. Good heavens, it'll be a long time before Margaret Thatcher says, come and reorganize the Cabinet Office. Let the Cabinet Office reorganize itself by action learning. But the range of its application is now so vast that to try and concentrate and say it belongs in this field would be totally wrong.
Professor, as a methodology for solving problems and learning in education and the workplace, action learning obviously has lots of applications. Can I turn to the learner though? If I'm a learner who has been accustomed to more traditional approaches and now I'm moving into an action learning style of process, what does that mean to me? What's going to be different for me?
Well, let me tell you this is an absolutely true story. I ran an action learning program in Belgium, and it has actually put the productivity of Belgium to the top of the world list. And at the end of the first program, they said, we're going to have a banquet in honor of Professor Revens. I said, well, I'll come to the banquet and bring my wife, but I'm not going to make a speech. And there were a lot of people there from all banks, insurance companies, department stores, steelworks, non-ferrous metal refineries, oil refineries, all the lot. And I said to them, following up your question, I said, you've all been in this, you've all been learners, I haven't told you anything, you've worked together on each other's problems, but on the dining tables at which you're all sitting, in front of you is this great menu card with your name on it in marvelous handwriting. I want to take those cards away as my reward for having helped you in this way, or having learned a lot about myself about it. But what I want you to do is to write on the back of that card, what do you think is the most important question which you have learned to ask yourself? What have you discovered most about yourself by going through this experience? I said, but before you write it down, please discuss it with your wife, who is sitting, that is your wife sitting next to you, yes? At least that's what we invited her as. So before you answer this question, discuss it with your wife, and then send it up to me. Oh, and by the way, what I want you to do is to write it in the language which you first spoke at your mother's knee, on your mother's knee, because in Belgium they speak 3 languages. 48% speak French, 46% speak Flemish, and the remainder speak German. And so we had them. I said, write it down in your own language. And as they sent the cards in, I wrote up on Butcher's paper what they'd written. And I said, I now want you to vote, all of you, vote for which of those questions do you wish you had asked? The questions about yourself. What do you think that question they all voted for said, we wish we'd put that question. It was this: what is an honest man, and what need I do to become one? Because if what you are doing is investigating a real pressing problem for which you yourself carry immediate personal responsibility, and you cannot push that off onto somebody else and say, well, it was his fault, or we didn't get the right advisors here, you carry the final can. What they realized was their need never to pretend to be somebody whom they were not. And if someone would like me to summarize what I think of university education, a lot of it is merely an apprenticeship to go around the world passing yourself off as somebody you are not. That's what you learn in universities. You become an MBA. And at one, I had to speak after the chairman of the Stock Exchange in Hong Kong had been arrested. They asked me to go out there, and at the end of my talk, somebody said, does MBA stand for Moral Bankruptcy Assured? So I'm not sure about that. I said, I don't know. It may not mean that in words, but it may be that in behavior, that's exactly what it does mean. But I think what action learning has done, if it's genuine action learning, is to make people aware that they must not pretend to be somebody they're not, and above all, not to pretend to be the expert they're claiming to be. That they say, well, yes, I may understand 90%, 95% of this, but there are things here I don't understand. And this is what you learn from action learning. Again, look, it won't take long. You will very soon discover that if what you're into is genuine action learning, you will very soon find that really there are ways in which you should be looking at what you're doing, which are not those to which you've grown up and become accustomed.
And would these, for you, be the personal benefits that you're obtaining?
Oh, yes. Not only personal to yourself, but benefits to other people.
Mm.
Now, I know I've been accused of moral evangelism, but let at least me quote here from the Bible, and I've seen copies of the Bible in Australia. People have got it. There's an argument between Jesus and the experts. The experts, of course, were the Pharisees. And he had been talking, not unlike yourselves, not unlike the pair of you, he'd been talking about the need for people to be a little better in their behavior. And he, of course, was referring to the kingdom of heaven. And the Pharisees kept saying to him, but what is this kingdom of heaven? How are people better? Of course, if you read the St. Luke's Gospel, it's put rather differently. The actual quote is this. This is Luke chapter 17, verses 20, 21. The words in the Oxford Authorized Version are, and when it was demanded of him by the Pharisees when the kingdom of heaven should come, he answered them and said, the kingdom of heaven cometh not by outward show, neither shall ye say, look, it is here, nor look, it is there, for behold, the kingdom of heaven is within you. What, of course, he's inferring is that if you really want to understand and be truthful, it's not sufficient just to say, listen to this chap or listen to that. You've also got to ask yourself a few questions. And that is the absolute essence of action learning. If you're dealing with complex reality, it's no good saying, that explains it or that explains it. That may be a part explanation, and that may be a part explanation. But if you've got to handle it, you've also got to ask yourself who you are, what you believe in, what you can do. And that's the final value, to me, of action learning.
Some people must find that process fairly liberating, mustn't they? To be legitimised, to be able to ask further questions rather than feeling bound to know all there is about their particular discipline.
Yes, okay. It's true, but the last thing I want to do is to give the impression that I'm going to teach them how to do it, or that even if they read the Bible, they'll learn how to do it. They will only learn to do it by themselves being engaged in some real mess which they have to do something about, but they will learn with and from others who are also in that same mess. Jesus' reference to the kingdom of heaven being within you, please don't think I'm disputing that. I would like to add something more. As in the Cavendish, when we were trying to understand in this vast complex of Nobel Prize winners and other people of almost the same level, what we were trying to do there was to explore our own capacity to ask fresh questions. That the seminars we ran weren't to convince other people how clever we were. They were to help us explore our own misunderstandings. And I think that as action learning extends, so people begin to see that by getting involved with others in the solution of real problems, and I use an expression here, comrades in adversity, and when I use the word comrades, don't think I've come from Moscow or anything like that, but only when you're in trouble with other people who say, okay, we're in trouble too, how do you ask yourself fresh questions? But never run an action learning program in which some people are so confident that they know the answers to everything, they will actually stop the other people from exchanging their misunderstandings and their ways of asking themselves who they are and what they believe in.
Professor Evans, you've actually given us quite interesting insights into action learning, ones that I didn't realise. The moral dimension, for example. Do you have any particular difficulties with the way people are using action learning processes these days to make money?
If I started to tell the truth of what I feel, I would at once be sued for libel by up to 100 different management consultants. So I'll keep quiet on that.
All right, fine, thank you.
But I'm giving a television talk on that in New York, I hope. And you have a look at that, because what I'm going to say on there, I've ensured that I shall not be sued by the experts. Yes. No, but you have to go through that. A lot of people are selling bogus, hocus-pocus action learning, charlatanism. But you must expect that. But I don't want to mention any of them by name.
Good. All right, well, on that note, we'll end there, Professor Evans, and thank you very much for your time this morning, and we do hope that your stay in Australia will be a pleasant one.
There's one thing I would like to say, and I hadn't, and please don't think I'm all that conceited. I'm only a professor, I must be conceited for that. But I'm delighted to come here because exactly 60 years ago, this month, July 1930, I won 2 silver medals in the first Commonwealth Games in Hamilton, Ontario, and I come here, and outside I see the stadium on which you had the Games of 1982.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to walk round that stadium and try and imagine I'm 60 years younger. I'm walking around the stadium.
Good.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Evans.
Professor Evans. Appreciate your time.